Picture a standard third-grade classroom. The fluorescent lights are humming, it's quiet reading time, and in the back row, a student is just staring at a page that won't make sense. Frustrated, he shoves the book off his desk. It hits the floor with a loud thud. Now, you have to freeze that exact moment, because right there, reality splits in two. In one version of this story, the system looks at that action and sees a struggle to decode words. A teacher marks a digital file. Learning support. The student gets a reading specialist, he masters phonics, and, eventually goes on to college. But in the other version, same kid, same book, same loud thud, the system sees defiance. A different checkbox is clicked. Behavioral issue. That student doesn't get a tutor, he gets detention, then suspension. He starts internalizing the label of the bad kid, and 10 years later, he isn't walking across a graduation stage, he's walking into a courtroom. What's so terrifying about this isn't the drama of the outcome, but the absolute, the banality of the cause. It wasn't some grand, malicious plot that derailed a life. It was just paperwork. It was a single, hasty decision to click one drop-down menu option over another because it felt close enough at 2:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. It really makes you wonder, how many of us are walking around right now living out a life story that was actually decided by a clerical error 10 years ago?
And that, right there, is precisely the mission of this deep dive. We are talking about the terrifying banality of misclassification. That moment of classification, whether it's a drop-down menu in a third-grade file, a policy decision in a university, or, a risk score spat out by an algorithm. That is the unseen lever of power in modern life.
So what we're saying is the real terror isn't malicious intent, it's just bureaucratic apathy, a rush decision or a glitch that just happens to dictate a life story.
Exactly. Every single system that touches human existence, from schools sorting students by need to justice systems sorting people by threat, it all relies on classification. And when it works, it provides support, it provides efficiency. But when it fails, the harm accumulates so quietly, often leading people to live inside a story that began with one single misclassified moment. So we are diving into how institutional classification operates across education, justice, and increasingly technology, because most of these powerful systems, they lack the necessary ethical guidance.
Right, and that's the critical gap we need to address. It's not just about finding the mistake, it's about fixing the broken machinery that allowed the mistake to be so consequential in the first place.
And that brings us to the ethical framework that's been designed to fill that gap, often called the black line framework. The name is simple, but it's crucial. It's literally about drawing an ethical boundary, a black line you cannot cross, when making these high-stakes classifications about human lives. It's built to address that ethical vacuum where systems lack guards.
So it's sort of reinforcing professional human judgment, but also holding the system itself accountable for its structure.
It demands that systems classify with three core principles: accuracy, proportionality, and transparency. Accuracy demands the label must truly reflect the reality of the person. Proportionality requires the consequence of the label to fit the actual risk or need. And transparency, well, it demands the process be explainable. The ultimate goal is to make sure our decision pathways don't punish normal human variation or, misinterpret a struggle as a risk.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with our first major consequence of misclassification. How classifying struggle as defiance quietly erodes the promise of meritocracy. I recently came across a story that it perfectly illustrates how prioritizing this kind of therapeutic compliance over raw aptitude classifying struggle as defiance can quietly dismantle the whole promise of meritocracy, all within the walls of a school.
And this is such a crucial area because the classification often happens long before the professional world. It happens in education. The promise of the modern American education system is supposed to be that it finds and cultivates raw talent, right? Regardless of background.
Precisely. And so try to imagine a classroom in a mid-sized suburban town. There's a 10-year-old boy, we'll call him Leo. Leo is brilliant. I mean, he's creating these complex mechanical structures out of scraps, constantly building, but he's also loud. He disagrees with teachers when he thinks they're wrong, and he refuses to sit still during quiet periods. He has this raw, undeniable, if, occasionally disruptive aptitude.
Right. And in a previous era, that teacher might have intuitively just channeled that raw kinetic energy toward, say, a robotics club or an accelerated math program. The system would have prioritized identifying and rewarding his competence.
Instead, the school had just implemented a behavioral tracking system, one designed to identify risks early. And that system flagged Leo's disagreement, his restlessness, his challenges, not as signs of intellectual engagement or boredom, but as potential psychological risks. The system quickly suggested the classification: oppositional defiant disorder. The classification focused entirely on compliance, not on his potential.
And the outcome then just reveals the whole systemic failure. Instead of entering the highly selective gifted and talented track, which is quantitative test scores and aptitude pretty clearly dictated, the algorithm diverted him. It pushed him into a social-emotional learning support track. The system's logic prioritized therapeutic compliance, the idea that he needed to be fixed over his raw, exceptional aptitude.
He was effectively classified out of his own potential. The system didn't fail to see him. It classified him as a broken object that needed repair and mandatory resocialization, not a nascent genius that needed a bigger challenge.
And this brings us directly to Michael Sandel's powerful critique of the modern ideology of meritocracy. This is where we really need to distinguish between two different ideas. First, there's merit as competence. This is the unobjectionable, practical notion that, if you need a neurosurgeon, you want a well-qualified, competent one. If you're getting on a plane, you demand a qualified pilot. This idea is just fundamental to safety and function.
That distinction makes perfect sense. I mean, we all want competence in critical, complex roles.
But that completely unobjectionable idea is then used to defend the much more contestable one, meritocracy as ideology. This is a governing philosophy, a way of allocating income, wealth, power, and honor according to what people are said to deserve. The core principle of this ideology is that if the field is level and chances are equal, which of course they never truly are, then the winners deserve their winnings.
And here's the painful punchline to that, right? If the winners deserve their winnings, then by implication, those who struggle, those who are misclassified, or those who simply lose out, they're implicitly told they deserve their fate.
That is the dark side of the ideology. As economic inequalities have widened globally, this meritocratic attitude has just tightened its grip, fostering a deep social division. It leads the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success, fostering what Sandel calls meritocratic hubris. They often forget the luck, the good fortune, and the systemic advantages that were involved in their journey.
That's a painful diagnosis. It makes you wonder how many of us, myself included, have, at one point or another, inhaled too deeply of our own success when things go right, forgetting just the sheer randomness and luck involved.
Precisely. And conversely, those who struggle, or those who, like Leo, are misclassified and derail early, are left with this crushing humiliation and deep resentment. They internalize the belief that the system is just, and therefore they are the ones who failed and deserved their struggle because they didn't comply with the rules that were set by the system.
And Sandel doesn't just discuss personal attitude. He links this hubris to, national failures.
Right. He points out this fascinating historical comparison. The meritocratically credentialed elites of recent decades, the economists, the technocrats, the Ivy League educated who brought us the 2008 financial crisis, the endless wars and stagnant wages, they actually have a worse governance record than earlier, less credentialed elites who won World War II and presided over 4 decades of broad-based economic growth.
So the very system that was designed to reward objective credentialed competence actually produced a series of massive economic and geopolitical follies. I mean, it's hard to ignore that data point.
It suggests that the focus on rigid credentialing and technical expertise has sort of distorted the mission of our institutions, turning them into arbiters of opportunity in this very narrow, market-driven sense. And when this technocratic conception of merit replaces older notions that connected merit to, say, virtue, character, and good judgment about the common good, the whole system just loses its social solidarity.
And this brings us to an even broader societal critique, shifting from education to the philosophical control of behavior, the idea of the therapeutic state.
Yes, and this is where Thomas Szasz's core critique becomes essential, which he articulated so powerfully in The Myth of Mental Illness. Szasz argued that mental illness is often a myth, a euphemism for problems in living. For him, diagnoses aren't objective scientific facts. They are inherently judgments of social disapprobation used by authorities to support their power over unconventional people.
So he saw psychiatry and psychology, at least in many institutional contexts, not as purely medical fields, but as a system of social control, just disguising itself in the language of science.
He saw it as a pseudoscience that parodies medicine. He believed that the medicalization of government designating someone as insane or a drug addict or now a person with oppositional defiant disorder produces what he called the therapeutic state.
The therapeutic state, that's such a sharp distillation. For anyone listening, what exactly did Szasz mean by that phrase when he coined it back in 1963?
He defined it as a system where disapproved actions, thoughts, and emotions, things like unhappiness, shyness, drug use, sexual promiscuity, or even just high-intensity disagreement like Leo's, are repressed or cured through these pseudomedical interventions, often administered by state authority or state-sanctioned institutions.
So it's basically authoritarianism in a lab coat. Control disguised as care.
Exactly. The system doesn't punish you for being a bad person or committing a sin. It attempts to cure you for being an unwell person. But the result is still the repression of unconventional, non-compliant, or challenging behavior. Szasz drew analogies between the persecution of witches in the theological state and the persecution of insane people in the therapeutic state. He argued both serve to enforce societal norms under the guise of protecting the populace from some kind of metaphysical or medical harm.
But wait, if we accept that Szasz's critique applies to social deviance, how does he account for genuine biological psychiatric illness, not just problems in living? I mean, is he arguing all mental illness is a social construct?
And that's the critical, challenging question his critics always raise, and where his theory becomes really controversial. Szasz was very clear. He was specifically targeting instances where behavior or social conflict was medicalized and treated via coercion, like involuntary commitment. He argued that only conditions with demonstrable physical, biological lesions or clear somatic causes should be considered diseases. He believed most behavioral diagnoses fell outside this very rigid definition, making them ethical and social problems masquerading as medical ones.
But regardless of whether you accept his biological rigidity, his insight is so powerful. When the school system's algorithm prioritizes therapeutic compliance, fixing Leo's supposed disorder, the system loses sight of its core social mission, which should have been identifying and rewarding competence. The therapeutic imperative just supersedes the meritocratic promise.
And that failure to protect the individual's potential is a profound betrayal, often committed by the very institutions designed to nurture them. This brings us perfectly to our next theme, institutional betrayal.
Right. So let's move from those broad ideological critiques to a really detailed look at how institutional systems fail the very people who depend on them. We're diving into the critical concept of institutional betrayal, or AB.
Institutional betrayal is a framework that's rooted in betrayal trauma theory. That theory focuses on the intense impact of interpersonal trust violation, typically when a trusted caregiver causes harm. IB takes that framework and scales it up. It explores the harm caused by trusted institutions, like a university, a religious organization, or even a healthcare system, when their actions or inactions cause further injury or trauma to those who rely on them.
So it's not just the original trauma or the original failure, it's the institutional response to that trauma that creates this whole additional injury and a violation of the victim's trust in the structure itself.
Absolutely. And the insidious nature of IB is that it is largely invisible and structural. It's just woven into the policies and the culture. IB includes acts of omission, like the failure to systematically prevent harm, as well as acts of commission, like creating confusing or overly burdensome policies that make it harder for victims to report incidents or seek accommodation.
This concept seems to manifest at every single layer of an organization. How do we categorize those layers so you can get a handle on it?
The research uses Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory to categorize these failures. But think of it simply. The individual level is the staff member's attitude. The microsystem is the direct interaction in a space. The mesosystem is the bureaucracy and the policies. And the exosystem is the big, invisible institutional culture and power structure.
Okay, let's focus on the mesosystem and the exosystem, since those are where systemic classification failures are most damaging, moving beyond just individual bad actors.
In the mesosystem, which is where policies and procedures live, IB occurs when the reporting process is perceived as confusing, overly bureaucratic, or inaccessible for survivors. This is where misclassification gets administrative. It includes policies that mandate gag orders or non-disclosure agreements that promote the systematic silencing of survivors, prioritizing institutional secrecy over individual healing.
That structural gap, where the policy says one thing, we support survivors, but the practice says another, you must fill out 10 complicated forms and we won't follow up for 6 months. That's often the hardest thing for an individual to navigate during a time of crisis.
It's a second wave of trauma. They are navigating a personal crisis, and now they are forced to navigate this complex, confusing bureaucracy that seems almost designed to exhaust them into giving up. Procedural institutional support, or IS, on the other hand, means procedures that center empowerment, that avoid taking control out of the survivor's hands, and that ensure the timely provision of accommodations like flexible academic or work schedules. Conversely, a failure to convey policy clearly via an accessible website with plain language is, in itself, a subtle form of betrayal.
And finally, we get to the exosystem, the structural core, and an institutional culture. This is the big picture where classification and hierarchy inflict the deepest harm.
This is where the structural and systemic IB is most deeply rooted. Structurally, betrayal occurs through these entrenched hierarchical power structures. The most egregious examples include a refusal to remove known perpetrators, especially high-status individuals like tenured faculty, star athletes, or high-performing executives, because the institution deems them too valuable to lose.
This sounds like the institution prioritizing damage control and its reputation over the basic safety and needs of its members.
Exactly. Damage control responses, or a deep organizational culture of deliberate indifference, are hallmarks of exosystem betrayal. A culture of deliberate indifference means there's this feigned ignorance of the problem, or the institutional response is so consistently poor that students or employees come to expect a negative, minimizing, or retaliatory institutional response.
That's a truly profound consequence. The system has betrayed people so consistently that a poor response becomes the cultural norm, and trust is just completely eroded.
Right. And institutional support at this level demands real commitment, structural investment in prevention and support resources, taking action to remove known perpetrators, and crucial intra-organizational collaboration to prevent siloed efforts. It requires sustained commitment to anti-oppressive practices to cultivate better values and ideologies within the culture itself. These necessary changes require considerable structural investment, not just individual attitude adjustments.
So we've seen how these structural failures and bureaucratic misclassification can erode meritocracy and betray trust. Now, let's transition to the technological front line of classification and the new risks that emerge when ideological biases are automated by these opaque systems. Yeah, I came across an anecdote that really highlights the terrifying absence of common sense when rigid ideological frameworks infiltrate our AI classification systems, automating the classification of human nuance.
And this is where the sheer speed and the lack of human interaction in AI just amplify the risks of betrayal we were just talking about. It's no longer just a busy administrator checking the wrong box. It's lines of code making a permanent, unchallengeable decision about a person's identity or their future.
Exactly. So picture a senior project manager named Sarah working at a global tech firm. Sarah is known for her extreme efficiency and direct management style. She keeps her team focused and protects them from endless meetings and scope creep. She has a firm, results-oriented style. This doesn't work, let's move on. The company recently implemented a new employee sentiment AI to monitor internal communications for exclusionary tones, calibrated with very specific, socially progressive parameters intended to promote inclusion.
And the stated intention is often very noble, to ensure a safe and non-toxic workplace, but the implementation often focuses on these rigid compliance metrics that just lack real-world context.
That's exactly what happened here. The system, lacking human interaction context and heavily weighted to detect perceived microaggressions, flagged her directness as psychologically unsafe behavior and a high risk to inclusive culture. The system classified her as a toxic leader in her permanent employee file. The irony is, Sarah was probably protecting the company from financial risk and burnout, and the AI classified her as the risk. You almost can't make this stuff up.
The system lacked nuance. A normal variation in management style, being firm and competent, was misinterpreted as a systemic risk, effectively criminalizing competence in the name of safety. And this raises the critical question of what happens when these systems are deliberately manipulated to enforce certain worldviews, which brings us to the concept that has entered the public discourse: woke AI.
Okay, if we are going to dive into woke AI, we need to be really precise and impartial here. We're defining this as a generative AI system deliberately manipulated so that on average, its outputs favor or exclude a specific political or cultural viewpoint. The core issue is the intentional manipulation hidden in the system's tuning, not just, unintentional bias in the vast training data.
And we've seen clear-cut examples of this manipulation. We saw the incident with Google's Gemini image generation tool overrepresenting certain demographic categories, leading to historically inaccurate images like non-white founding fathers in an attempt to counter inherent racial biases in training data. The implementation just it backfired spectacularly.
Right. And we also saw systems inserting highly ideological content that was totally unrelated to the user's query, which indicates these hard-coded guardrails or instructions influencing the output.
This shows the speed at which intentional bias can be introduced. But generative AI is fundamentally different from the previous battleground, which was social media. Social media platforms only steer content posted by users. They are content filters. Generative AI services create content, which offers a more direct and potent opportunity to introduce bias or ideological concepts.
That distinction is crucial. Generative AI is much more active.
And its feedback is more direct. It either generates the desired response or it explicitly refuses to, often citing ethical or safety guidelines, which allows users to test the bounds of the system's manipulation much more easily than they could on opaque social media feeds.
So why are companies and even governments enforcing these biases in the first place? It seems counterintuitive if you're trying to build a useful, objective tool.
There are two main buckets of pressure. First, you have market and social pressures. Companies have strong financial incentives to avoid PR disasters, litigation risk from defamatory, hallucinated, or plagiarized content, and just general liability. This drives a rise in what we call safety culture, where they prefer extreme caution over openness. They impose guardrails to prevent content that could be seen as controversial, even if it limits the factual scope.
And the second pressure is this rapidly increasing government oversight.
Correct. Government pressure. Even before new AI laws take effect and global governments are considering hundreds of AI-related bills, companies are preemptively restricting their models to align with anticipated regulation. This regulatory pressure includes mandatory AI assessments that often focus heavily on misinformation, disinformation, and critically harmful bias detection.
And these anti-bias requirements, often pushed by advocacy groups, mandate that models align with certain diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI standards.
Which is where the conflict becomes most acute, particularly in the U.S. political landscape. While the goal is, of course, to prevent discrimination, these requirements can often shape AI outputs in politically sensitive ways.
That conflict really crystallized with the Trump administration's Prevent Woke AI executive order. This order mandates that federal agencies procure AI systems adhering to ideological neutrality and explicitly purges references to things like systemic bias, DEI, and climate science from federal risk frameworks.
Right. The administration framed the executive order as seeking truth-seeking and ideological neutrality, mandating that systems not manipulate responses in favor of ideological dogmas like DEI. The administration maintained that these DEI concepts suppress factual information and represent an ideological threat to reliable AI systems.
But critics argue that this effort, rather than being neutral, is itself a political lens that equates the acknowledgement of structural bias with ideological distortion.
And that is the paradox we have to neutrally report on here. Critics argue that because concepts like systemic bias, if defined by academic research, are scientifically acknowledged, this effort risks introducing a conservative bias by demanding their erasure. The administration, however, maintained these concepts suppress factual information. When the very discussion of bias is banned, the system can't self-correct for existing harms.
And for those unfamiliar, the NIST RMF, that's a lot of government jargon. Could you quickly explain what the NIST RMF is?
Sure. The NIST RMF, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology Risk Management Framework, is essentially the U.S. government's official playbook for assessing risk in federal IT systems. If you purge terms like systemic bias from that playbook, you are fundamentally changing the tools and the metrics that federal agencies use to assess if an AI system is fair or safe.
And ignoring structural bias has already caused significant quantifiable harm completely outside of this political debate.
Absolutely. We have concrete, non-ideological examples. Amazon's hiring AI, which was trained primarily on historical data dominated by male resumes, was shown to filter out qualified female candidates. That is structural bias in action, regardless of anyone's political viewpoint. Similarly, if you strip climate data from predictive models, you degrade accuracy for disaster response, wildfire forecasts, and flood risk assessments, undermining national resilience for purely political reasons.
So the key takeaway is that when a model overcorrects, like the Gemini image incident, that's a technical bug that can be fixed through iteration. But when entire concepts are banned from the training loop, especially concepts necessary for assessing accuracy in the real world, That's not a fixable bug. It's a skewed operating system, and it introduces deep, lasting vulnerabilities into national systems.
And that just underscores the critical need for governance, which is our final and most important focus, building the guardrails of the black line framework to ensure accuracy and transparency can survive political pressures and technical complexity.
Let's shift our focus now to the solution side of this equation, building the necessary ethical guardrails to restore trust and prevent these systemic failures through strong technology governance.
Yes, we have to move from diagnosis to remedy. The need for robust governance is crystal clear, especially when you consider the consequence of systems that prioritize speed and scale over human reality. We need to focus on how to build systems that reflect the core principles of the black line: accuracy, proportionality, and transparency.
I think we have to look at the story of Marcus, which illustrates the really chilling result of bad data governance, where the line between digital identity and physical reality just dissolves because accountability has vanished.
This is a scenario that experts in data governance constantly warn us about. It demonstrates why we need strict accountability mechanisms, particularly in an increasingly atomized society where systems talk to systems, but no one talks to the person being classified.
So Marcus was a logistics coordinator, a law-abiding citizen. One morning, his company dispatch system locked him out. His rideshare app was suspended. His bank account was frozen. The root cause was a background check algorithm used by a third-party data broker. Due to similarities in his last name, birth year, and maybe an old address, the algorithm had merged Marcus's identity with that of a known felon.
And the structural failure is immediate. Because no ethical guardrails or human review were mandated by the software's governance policy, the system treated a high-probability match, a statistically likely link, as absolute verified fact. Marcus was instantly classified as a high-security threat and blacklisted by every system that accessed that data stream.
He wasn't the victim of a crime. He was the victim of bad data governance. The system prioritized speed and scale, and in doing so, it destroyed his livelihood because the principles of accuracy and proportionality were just completely ignored. There was no mechanism for challenge or recourse.
And this underscores why the black line framework must insist on responsibility. Technology is powerful, but without strict governance ensuring accuracy and proportionality, these systems don't just make mistakes, they destroy trust in the infrastructure of our daily lives. The individual is left utterly powerless against a network of machines that refuse to even acknowledge their existence.
So data governance is the cornerstone of responsible AI. What are the fundamentals we need to establish to prevent these kinds of structural failures?
Governance is the set of rules, policies, and practices that establish how organizations manage data, from collection all the way to utilization. For AI, it must ensure data is reliable, fair, explainable, and collected ethically. We need 4 core components that have to be non-negotiable. First, data quality management. This is the bedrock of accuracy. It ensures that the data being processed and used in AI systems is accurate, complete, consistent, and up-to-date. Poor data quality is incredibly expensive, costing organizations millions annually, and it directly translates to bad decisions in AI systems. The Marcus story is a clear failure of data quality because a probability was not treated as data about probability, but data as fact. That makes perfect sense. Garbage in, catastrophic decision out. Well, what's the second critical component? Second is metadata management and data lineage. We need information describing where the data came from, what it represents, its format, and its entire journey. Its lineage from source through processing, transformation, and eventual use in the AI model. This provides traceability and transparency, making it possible to unpack and correct flawed or questionable outcomes.
Which is incredibly hard when models, especially large deep learning networks, function as these opaque black boxes.
Exactly. Opacity and complexity are inherent challenges. Strong data lineage is the only way to adhere to the black line's transparency mandate. Third, access control and data security. This defines who can access, edit, or share sensitive or personal data. This is crucial for maintaining individual privacy and ensuring compliance with regimes like GDPR, especially for high-risk classification data.
And finally, governance needs to keep up with systems that are constantly changing and learning in real time.
Yes. The fourth component is dynamic data environments. Many AI systems continually learn and adapt using real-time streaming data. In these contexts of continual change, robust governance processes and monitoring mechanisms are essential to catch and correct deviations. We must prevent what's called model mission drift, where over time, a system that started ethically begins to slide toward an unethical or biased purpose because the data streams feeding it have changed.
And if governance fails in these 4 areas, The results aren't just technical errors. They are ethical violations that lead directly to harm.
When we look at the ethical consequences of weak governance, the pattern is just so clear. Inaccurate or biased data sets violate fairness, leading to discrimination, as we saw with the Amazon hiring tool. Lack of documentation or lineage violates transparency, making AI decisions unexplainable, like that proprietary compass algorithm used in courts.
Could you just briefly explain the compass algorithm for context?
Certainly. The compass algorithm is a predictive tool used in certain U.S. courtrooms to assess the recidivism risk of defendants, how likely they are to reoffend. When the methodology is proprietary and the decision can't be unpacked by the defense attorney or the defendant, it violates the transparency needed for proportionality in sentencing.
And a lack of clear ownership means a violation of accountability.
Precisely. The absence of clear roles and responsibility, the who owns the error problem, means there is no entity held liable for algorithmic harm. This reveals a clear chain of failure. Weak data governance leads to biased data, which creates unfair or opaque AI models, resulting in violations of ethical principles and ultimately consequences like discrimination and a total loss of trust.
So, how do we operationalize the Black Line framework principles of accuracy, proportionality, and transparency? What regulatory and organizational mandates are required to impose these ethical guardrails?
We need concerted action on three essential fronts, focusing on building systems of control. First, regulatory and policy mandates. Governments should mandate regular algorithmic audits, ethical impact assessments, and fairness checks, particularly for high-stakes classification decisions in healthcare, finance, and law enforcement.
What does an algorithmic audit actually entail in practice?
An audit is much more rigorous than a simple compliance check. It assesses the model's performance against specific metrics of fairness, proportionality, and consistency across demographic groups, often using testing data that attempts to induce bias. It asks, does the penalty assigned by the system proportionality match the actual risk? Does the system classify people consistently, or does it misclassify certain groups at higher rates accuracy? Audits are necessary to ensure the system is doing what it claims to be doing. Furthermore, we have to require explainability laws. This is crucial for transparency. When a decision is made, say, denying a loan or flagging a student, the rationale must be provided in a standalone, human-readable format that clearly describes to the person why the classification occurred.
And beyond regulation, what should organizations themselves be doing to internalize these principles?
They need strong organizational best practices. This starts with establishing multidisciplinary ethical review boards before implementation, not as an afterthought, but as a mandatory checkpoint. These boards must include not just engineers, but ethicists, social scientists, and legal experts to analyze the potential downstream effects of classifications. Organizations must also implement strong data governance frameworks with clear stewardship roles, designating people who are explicitly liable for data quality and model performance. They must also mandate bias mitigation training for development teams, ensuring they understand how their initial choices in classification parameters can have massive ethical consequences.
And the industry needs to step up to create a baseline of trust that extends beyond any single company's policy.
Yes, industry standards are essential. We need broad collaboration across academia, industry, and government to set minimum ethical standards, referencing examples like i.e. ethically aligned design or international standards like the EU AI Act's strict rules for high-risk classification systems. Ultimately, AI systems should eventually be certified by a third party for ethical readiness and data governance maturity, just like products are subject to quality and safety testing.
Ultimately, building these ethical guardrails is about protecting the human element. It's about protecting trust in the system, ensuring that classification is a tool for progress, not for institutional betrayal.
It is. Robust governance ensures AI systems are trustworthy, lawful, and socially responsible. It prevents the entire chain of ethical failure we described. It ensures that when systems talk to systems, they are exchanging accurate, proportional, and verified information, thereby restoring public confidence in the infrastructure we increasingly depend on and adhering to the Black Line.
We started this deep dive with the story of a third-grade student whose life trajectory split based on a single classification choice learning support versus defiance. What we've explored is that whether it's a manual drop-down menu in a classroom or a proprietary algorithm deciding financial or professional fate, classification is the unseen lever of power in modern life. The power of the label dictates the path.
We are at a critical friction point where the ideology of meritocracy, the structural failures of institutional betrayal, and the opacity of technologically driven classification systems all collide. Without ethical frameworks that mandate accuracy, transparency, and proportionality, the core principles of the Black Line, we risk silently exaggerating existing harms and imposing technologically determined versions of reality that are politically skewed or simply inaccurate.
The journey to socially responsible systems lies not just with continuous technological innovation, but with the collective, concerted effort to embed ethics, governance, and human accountability into the very foundation of classification.